What's up, everybody? It's Max from Zima Automotive. We are here this month talking about AC services, air conditioning services in vehicles. What is all entitled? What are the components? What does it do? And why is it just not as cold as you want it to be on those hot summer days where it's nice and humid and everything else going on? So briefly, we're just going to kind of talk about the components of the AC system and then what we expect out of them. So let's start with the heart and soul of the beast, and that would be your air conditioning compressor. That is going to take the refrigerant. There are a couple different types of refrigerant. We'll get into those. And it will circulate it through a system. So to look at the AC system as a giant circle, there are certain stages that it has to go through along the way. But it all starts with that compressor. Now the compressor is not always on. There's two main parts to the compressor. One is the internal pistons that creates pressure, and then the outer part is called the clutch. So when the computer or the different sensor tells the air conditioner compressor, hey, it's time to come on, it will actually turn on an electromagnet which sucks this clutch in and then drives the compressor. The compressor does take anywhere from about 15 to 20 horsepower from the engine, so that's why it's not on all the time, because it would just rob constant power from the engine, cause your gas mileage to get worse, and we all know what a horrible thing that would be. So to supplement that, they put a clutch on the front, and that comes on and off, and then when that compressor is not engaged, it's just a free spinning pulley, and there's really no force on it, doesn't take any horsepower, anything from the engine. But when that's on, you got two sides to your AC system, a high side and a low side, and the compressor creates the high side pressure, which will be anywhere from about 120 psi up to, on a really hot day, it might be, in the 300s. And that will circulate that through a system, and then it gets to a spot where it will actually drop the pressure down to about 30 psi, and it's that drop in pressure that creates cold air. So think about it as if you blow into a balloon, and you got this big balloon, and then you open up that balloon, you can actually feel the air coming out, and it's a little bit cooler because you're taking high pressure to low pressure. Anytime you go from high pressure to low pressure, you'll have a drop in temperature. When the pressure leaves the compressor, it's going to go through a part called a condenser. A condenser looks just like a radiator, and for its purposes, it does the exact same thing as a radiator, but they're usually much smaller, thinner than a radiator. So the job of the condenser is to cool down the system. So as we compress the refrigerant, and as the pressure goes up, the temperature is going to rise with it, and they kind of work together. As that temperature goes up, the pressure is going to go up even more. So we have to find a way to cool it back down to bring those pressures down, or else those pressures will go above 500 psi, and that's when we start having issues where we're blowing out O-rings, blowing lines, that type of thing. So the condenser sits right in the front of the vehicle, so we get the air moving across it as we go down the road. And there's also a fan on the backside that helps pull that air through it, and that will help regulate our temperature of the system. So that's an extremely important part. That's the condenser. Once it's done with the condenser, it's going to go through the lines, normally to either an orifice. So an orifice is just, a good way to explain it is it's taking a large area surface and it's taking it down to a smaller. So think of it as kind of a hole in the system. So we got a lot of high pressure coming in. Instead of just blocking it, we put a tiny hole in there, and it allows that pressure to drop. So we take the high pressure to low pressure, and that's where we get that drop in temperature, and we get the drop in pressure. After the orifice, and then on some systems, it's called an expansion valve. Once it gets to that portion, we are now dealing with the low pressure side, which generally is going to be in a 30 psi range. And at that point, it should be cooled down quite a bit, where it will go through an evaporator, which again looks just like a mini radiator. They're a lot smaller, and that purpose is it's going to run that cool air through there. Cool air is then pushed across that and pulled at the same time, and that goes through your vents, and that's how we get that cold temperature inside. And depending on the heat outside and the humidity, everything in this AC system is dependent upon that. So the more humid it is and the hotter it is outside, the harder it is to get those cooler temperatures inside the vehicle. There's only so much we can do once we start getting into those 90 and 100% humidity days. But normally we should still see temperatures in about 40 degrees coming out of the vents. Once that happens and it goes through that evaporator, it's sucked back through the air compressor, and cycle is repeated again. And that just keeps happening over and over again. So it's a constantly flowing system going through there. So anywhere along that line that we have maybe an O-ring or a line or something that could spring a leak, it's going to affect those pressures. As the pressures are affected, so is the temperature inside the vehicle. And that's why sometimes you're sitting at a light and without that air flowing across the condenser, you might notice the AC temp gets a little bit warmer. Then you start driving down the road and it cools back down. And that's because of the airflow going across that condenser. And again, you know, the cooler we can keep that temperature, the cooler we can keep the temperature inside the car. So everything is just this big fight for how cool can we keep the system, how can we maintain those pressures to get the optimal cooling outside the vents. All right, so we covered a lot of what happens underneath the hood and what happens in the engine compartment with the AC system, but what happens in here when we start hitting all these buttons and changing things around and making all kinds of noise inside the car? That's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So inside this dash on the back side is an entire, what we call HVAC box. And if you don't know, HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And inside there is a series of what we call flapper doors, and they're just long doors that open and close, and that redirects airflow. So whether you want airflow on the defroster, on the vents, on the floor, in the back, whatever your car has, the newer cars even have them in the seats. So that's all done through your main control unit. As you push these buttons and change your mode, it will change these flapper doors open, close in a different series, redirecting airflow depending where it goes. Another important feature we want to talk about is a recirculation door, and there's a button on here that usually shows it like as a loop or as air recirculating, and that's exactly what it does. So instead of pulling air through the fresh air intake and pulling fresh air from outside in, it just takes the air that's already inside the car. This has several advantages. One, sometimes you get behind a stinky car, or maybe you're driving through if you're in Ohio, you're driving through a cornfield and you're getting some of that manure smell, anything like that. You don't want the outside air or smell getting in. If you put it on that recirc mode, it will just recirculate the air inside the car, and you won't get any of those outside pollutants coming in. The other thing it does is instead of pulling 90-degree temperature from the outside inside the car and then cooling that down, you're dealing with the temperature inside the car. So it might be in the 60s or even 50s if you can get it cold enough. So we're just taking that air and cooling that down a little bit more, and it will just help with the overall performance of the AC system. So if it's not cooling down quite the way you want it to, try switching over to the recirc mode and see if that helps you drop that temperature down. If you get into a situation where you want it on the vents, but it's always stuck on the floor, a lot of times there's a mode door, which is just a tiny motor, and that's what's changing those flapper doors and opening and closing them. Sometimes those go bad and they get stuck, or just the electronics inside them fail, and we have to replace those. That's when things, you start seeing the cost of the repair bill going up a bit more because as you can see, there's not real good access to everything. We have to get up underneath the dash. In some cases, this entire dash will have to come off the vehicle to access those. So it's one of those, why did they build it that way? Well, to be able to keep the looks of the car and keep everything clean and looking, modern and what they have now, they have to hide that stuff, and that's the price we pay. We have to pull that dash out just to access it. So some of these repairs can get extremely expensive because of the amount of labor you have in there. It's not so much the part cost, but if we have to take this dash out, we're probably dealing with a 10 to 12 hour job just to get it out and back in. So that's why you see those repair costs go up and things get a bit more complicated when we start dealing with those blend doors and the recirculation doors and things inside the dash. So I hope that helped. I hope that explained it a little bit more. So we have to look at how in-depth this AC system goes. It just seems like it just keeps going and going. There's a lot of components to them, and a lot of those components are not easily serviceable. They're buried inside other components, and they just take a lot of time to access. So again, hope that helped. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments, and we'll respond. Make sure you like and subscribe to this video, and we'll keep sending you some more.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching that video. Don't forget to click and subscribe to this channel to get more information, or click over here and watch our next video.